Today we're going to be talking about ketamine as an antidepressant and alternative treatments to change the pathophysiology of MDD. We're going to be speaking about the expanded review, the historical perspective, the conceptual replication, and the ethical considerations.
Okay, so today we'll be going over an expanded review of ketamine as a treatment for major depressive disorder. Um, First, before we go into this, I wanted to set some learning goals. So I hope that from this section, you guys will be able to learn a little bit more about how ketamine is a promising rapid treatment for major depression, especially in treatment-resistant cases for depression. Then I will also be going over some current ketamine treatments that are being used in the field now. And then I will really go into the expanded review, looking at the proposed mechanism of treatment in recent review papers, and also looking at the major components that have, and the major studies that have led to these proposed mechanisms. So first, what is major depressive disorder? Major depressive disorder is affects 3.8% of the world, around 280 million people. Current treatments include talk therapies, antidepressants like SSRIs, transcranial magnetic stimulation, and electroconvulsive therapies. However, there are still over 30% of people with MDD, which is around 84 million people, that have treatment-resistant depression. So what does that mean? That's defined as patients with lingering depression symptoms after exhausting all treatment methods. There is a particular impact on teenagers, and unfortunately, there's no absolute cure found. So how does ketamine come into play? Ketamine, when used to treat depression, is dosed with minimal frequency as possible, but is actually seen as a very, very rapid antidepressant with relief from TRD as quickly as 40 minutes of treatment, as within 40 minutes of treatment, and also having long-term effects with long-term remission as long as 16 weeks into treatment. It's generally started with twice weekly dosing for the first month, and then winding it down so that then patients aren't treated more than once a month. And it is shown to have high efficacy for depression and constant in the context of treatment-resistant depression, bipolar disorder, OCD, PTSD. It really appears to be safe and have a very long-term efficacy. So going into the expanded review, I will be basing a lot of what I'm talking about following this based off of the work of Lisa M. Monteggia at the Neuropharmacology Lab at Vanderbilt School of Medicine. She's been doing extensive research on ketamine's antidepressant potential and mechanism of action for decades. I will be basing my expanded review based on the studies cited in her lab's most recent review paper in 2024. So one of the biggest things that have led ketamine to be explored as a potential antidepressant is because of its interactions with the N-methyl D-aspartate or NMDA receptor as an open channel blocker of the ionotropic glutamatergic NMDA receptors. The NMDA receptor is a receptor of glutamate, the primary excitatory neurotransmitter in the human brain, and it plays an integral role in synaptic plasticity, which is a neuronal mechanism believed to be the basis of memory formation, and also really the way that your brain is sort of interacting with emotions and other things like that. And as you can see on the right here is what the actual structure of ketamine is. So it is a small molecule. What does this mean, really, that it's blocking the NMDA? So studies have shown, actually, Azumi and Zoromsky, and then Autry et al., which was at the Monteggia lab, showed that this blockade of NMDA and this interference actually has interfered with Hebbian neuroplasticity, which is actually, in a lot of PTSD cases, decreased traumatic memory, like recall of traumatic memory. And it also has deactivated eukaryotic elongation factor 2, or the EEF2 kinase, which has resulted in fast-acting behavioral antidepressant-like effects. And this is one of the primary sort of understandings of what is this mechanism, like what is happening mechanistically. So this belief that deactivating this EEF2 is resulting in this fast-acting antidepressant effects that we're seeing from ketamine. But there's also a second proposal, and that's what I'm actually going to be looking at, this like one of the studies that was highlighted in the review, and that's what I'll be focusing on for the rest of the presentation. So ketamine has also been shown to rapidly activate the mTOR pathway. The mTOR pathway is mammalian target of rapamycin. It's a protein kinase that controls cellular metabolism, catabolism, immune responses, autophagy, survival, proliferation, and migration to maintain cellular homeostasis. And as you can see, it like from this NMDA blockade, it then downstream activates this mTOR, which I'll get into this whole thing at the end, but I just wanted to have this there. So in 2010, Lee and his collaborators wrote a paper called mTOR-dependent synapse formation underlies the rapid antidepressant effects of NMDA antagonists, specifically exploring the ketamine NMDA antagonists. And they put out a series of studies to examine cellular signaling pathways mediating actions of NMDA receptor blockade, focusing on signaling cascades that were already known to rapidly influence synaptic plasticity. So they had 3 findings. They found that glutamate alpha amino 3 hydroxy 5 methyl 4 isoxaxo, I'm not going to even try, AMPA receptors were required for activity through a remove experiment of these AMPA receptors. And then they also found that ketamine increased the mTOR-linked local protein synthesis in synapses, which are required for the formation and maturation of new synapses. And then they also determined through a remove experiment that activation of the mTOR signaling is required for the antidepressant behavioral response of ketamine. And essentially, they used a remove experiment by increasing or like adding in a rapamycin into the MPFC, the prefrontal cortex. And by doing that, that was basically going to deactivate mTOR signaling. So by deactivating mTOR signaling, they were able to show that it is actually needed to have that antidepressant behavioral response that is seen when you include ketamine. And so basically from the study, they were able to figure out that, or that they have proposed from their findings, that this NMDA receptor on GABA, specifically GABA releasing interneurons that then blockade GABA release, will then disinhibit the glutamate signaling and increase glutamate release. And that will cause AMPA activation, which is something that they saw in their paper, that they saw that AMPA was activated from the increase of ketamine. And then from there, that will increase synapse-associated signaling proteins in the prefrontal cortex and also increase spine number in the prefrontal cortex. From there, that results in a rapid elevation of serotonin receptors, the 5-HT neurotransmission, which is the antidepressant effect that one hopes to see. And so this is really key in understanding like another pathway that could potentially explain it. It's not just that NMDA is being inhibited, but rather maybe specific NMDA receptors on specific types of neurons then is what is really causing this rapid antidepressant effect. And so sort of honing in on what neurons are actually at play was really a key finding in this paper. So some future directions is that that this paper really highlighted, that they want to sort of understand better how this homeostatic plasticity is being used as a masking treatment for neuropsychiatric disorders. So like rather it's kind of a new understanding that ketamine's rapid antidepressant action may not actually fix depression, but rather instead is inducing this homeostatic plasticity to mask the effects of major depressive disorder, and sort of understanding how can we now like have a new avenue for treatment that we can actually make compounds that directly target this homeostatic plasticity instead of just trying to understand, can we actually just like can we break down the actual mechanism of action of major depressive disorder, but rather instead of doing that, just masking that impact and which one is going to have more effect. It's looking like from a lot of these findings that attacking this homeostatic plasticity and like masking the disorder instead of actually fixing the disorder actually might be more impactful in the long run. And the second thing is that they want to understand how can you sustain the antidepressant effects of ketamine. As I said, it is a rapid antidepressant, but it does have longer term effects. It's only longer term effects within like tens of weeks. So trying to understand how can we prolong it even more because ketamine is something that can be misused and overused very easily. So sort of trying to understand how can we prolong its effects and use it minimally. And then finally, uncovering novel therapeutics which target fast neurotransmission without impairing fundamental sensory and memory functions. Ketamine can also result in a lot of dissociative mechanisms in the brain, and that's a major concern in its use. But overall, a lot of these findings have been really critical, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Moving on to the next part.
Hi, my name is Marielle Baumgartner, and I'm going to be giving the historical overview of broadly hallucinogens and treatments for depression and other mental illnesses, but more specifically, ketamine, ketamine's history, at least its immediate history, and how it relates to depression and current uses. This began with Albert Hofmann, who isolated LSD before the World Wars, sometime in the 1920s, 1930s, and subsequently realized that it was a hallucinogen. And soon thereafter, a lot of research went into these hallucinogens and dissociative drugs, specifically because Freudian psychologists thought that the act of dissociation would allow repressed memories to come to the fore. And given that the entire point of Freudian psychology is to release repressed memories, there was a lot of research into these drugs and their usage. Indeed, before the 1970s, there were over 1,000 studies and it involved over 40,000 subjects. And this is for a wide range of different drugs, including LSD, PCP, magic mushrooms, and ketamine, which is going to be the rest of our focus. But then, because these drugs became widely available and widely used, they became overused in recreational drugs. And with the war on drugs in the 70s, they became fairly strictly banned, at least in the US, originally on Schedule 1, later on Schedule 2, and remained pretty banned, not necessarily ketamine, but a lot of the other ones, until the 1990s, where fMRI was invented, and suddenly there was evidence of how exactly they worked in the brain, and evidence that maybe it could support the healing of many mental illnesses like anxiety and OCD and depression and addiction disorders, PTSD, etc. And so since then, researchers have put a lot of effort into being allowed to run studies on these drugs because a lot of them are still relatively banned. So we're going to move on. So now I'm going to focus more specifically on ketamine. Ketamine was originally widely used as an anesthetic, and this is why it was not so greatly banned in the 70s, because in the 1960s was the first experiment where it showed that ketamine could be used as an anesthetic. It was actually discovered or produced as a derivative of earlier anesthetics, which had really, really strong hallucinogenic and other negative side effects, including loss of memory. And so there was a desire for something that could have a similar effect without as negative of side effects. And so Corson and Domino basically proved that you could use it as an anesthetic with 10 male volunteers from prison to begin with, where they injected it as an IV and measured the respiratory volume and ECG of these patients. And they basically continued to do so until the patients resumed their alpha rhythms or consciousness. So you can see in the chart in the top right, the dark squares are where the patients lost consciousness, and you can see all the other data charted. But it seemed to have worked, so then they expanded and used it on about 130 patients in clinical trials during about 133 surgical procedures to show that, yes, this was a safe anesthetic, and it did indeed reduce the negative side effects, and it was actually really extremely useful and desirable as an anesthetic beyond just less hallucinations, because of the fact that most other anesthetics paralyze the tracheal muscles, and ketamine doesn't. And so it's even widely used nowadays for situations in medical situations in which you want the patient to be unconscious without completely paralyzed, such as burn victims when they have their dressings changed. You don't want to have to intubate them, but it's too much pain for them to really survive consciously. And so it was mostly used as an anesthetic up until about the 2000s, when there's a lot more research into its use for PTSD and depression and whatnot. In terms of how it works, it has wide-ranging effects throughout the body, but just some notable ones. Cardiovascularly, it interacts with the calcium channels on the pulmonary system, that's your lungs. It affects the voltage-gated sodium channels. Neurological, which is what we're most interested in, it primarily acts as a blocker for NMDA, which, as we learned in the class, is greatly researched at this point for learning and other related cognitive functions. And actually ketamine, and the realization that ketamine affected NMDA was the thing that kicked off the research into NMDA receptors. It also greatly affects AMPA receptors and changes acetylcholine signaling and so on and so forth. It's also widely used as an analgesic, so a pain reliever for cancer patients and people who suffer from nerve pain. In terms of overdose and overuse mostly just results in a semi-permanent intoxicated-like state, which can seem to be resolved when you stop using ketamine for fun, basically. But luckily there is little risk of overdose because, as we just discussed, the drug affects so many different parts of the body that it doesn't seem to end up overdosing so much. Now I'm just going to summarize real quick the main study that preempted a lot of the research into depression with ketamine. In 1975, Sophia was the guy's last name, investigated the use of ketamine in rats and mice with depression symptoms. And so he basically compared it to other antidepressant drugs and their side effects. And so I'm just going to read this because this is chemistry, but basically the test on the ketamine showed reversal of this tetrabenazine-induced ptosis in mice, and reversal of this other medication-induced hypothermia in rats. But it unfortunately also enhanced this other medication, yohimbine, the toxicity of that medication in mice. But it also inhibited oxytryptamine, which is also another medication-induced tremors in mice. And so in general, the ketamine in that study was not as strong as an antidepressant as the other medication that they compared. But this was the first record of research into this topic, which later boomed and exploded so greatly. Moving on to specifically the neuroscience, because that's what we're most focused on in this class, because it blocks a lot of different signaling pathways in neurotransmitters, including acetylcholine. It can have a lot of intraneural effects in signaling pathways. As is perhaps intuited throughout before, small amounts of ketamine can increase cognitive processing, as with these hallucinogenics and dissociative symptoms, but large amounts can induce unconsciousness, so it's a little bit of a paradox in that way. Researchers and scientists also really like to use ketamine because of its connections with para-conscious and unconscious states. Seems to suggest that it might be a way to figure out the neural correlates of consciousness. And both the consciousness and the depression seem to be mostly related to its function in disrupting the cortical connectivity, especially mood-related cortical connectivity, and that specifically is interbrain regional connection, so communication between different regions of the brain. But interestingly enough, it doesn't actually affect other signaling, such as sensory input. So even when you're unconscious under ketamine, you still get sensory input through the thalamus. The research in the reviews I read suggested that the depression symptom alleviation may only be short-term, just because ketamine has such a short half-life of, I think, 15 minutes to 2 hours or so. And that's my bibliography. Thank you.
So today I'm going to be presenting on a conceptual replication of a key study in this field of looking at ketamine as an antidepressant. But before I get into that study, I just wanted to talk a little bit about our background about ketamine and looking at its mechanism of action. So research doesn't really know a lot about ketamine's mechanism of action, and there have been plenty of results that indicate that ketamine is able to have these really rapid and significant antidepressant effects, and sometimes these effects are even greater than the ones that SSRIs are able to have, but we still don't know what the exact neural pathways are, neural mechanisms, or neurotransmitters that are involved in terms of how ketamine is able to work as an antidepressant. And at the same time, there have also been studies that have shown that ketamine can be effective in treating patients who are resistant to selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And one acronym for this is SSRI resistant individuals, and these are individuals who are resistant to traditional medications for depression, such as Prozac. And so the fact that ketamine is able to be effective in treating these individuals is really significant, since this is such a chronic and damaging mental health disorder, and there's really limited medications outside of what the medical industry has traditionally been relying on. So a really important question in this field has been, how is ketamine treating MDD in patients who are resistant to traditional SSRIs? And so this leads into my research question, which is, how is ketamine affecting the serotonin levels in SSRI-resistant patients and alleviating MDD-related symptoms? And so this was a question that Tiger and al., a study done in 2020, was really trying to look at. And so we're going to dive a little bit into the methods of this study, and then talk a little bit about areas of uncertainty, and then a replication of this study done in animals. So Tiger and al. Had 30 SSRI-resistant major depressive disorder patients, and these patients were randomly assigned to one of two conditions. In one condition, they would either receive a ketamine infusion, or they would receive a placebo infusion. And so before patients received this treatment, and also after patients received this treatment, they went through a PET scan where researchers were able to measure their serotonin receptor binding levels. And so then researchers were able to compare across conditions how ketamine or the placebo infusion was affecting their serotonin receptor binding levels on average. And so researchers found a 16.7 increase in serotonin binding in the hippocampus after just one ketamine treatment. And they also found that this increase was associated with improvements in MDD-related symptoms. And so just to contextualize these results a little bit, this was just after one ketamine treatment, but researchers found that, again, after multiple ketamine treatments, there was still, increasing serotonin levels. And again, this was associated with some improvements in MDD symptoms. And so from this, researchers were able to say from the data that serotonin receptors could play a key role in ketamine's mechanism of action and how it could be alleviating symptoms of MDD even in SSRI-resistant patients. But again, there are always unanswered questions and areas of uncertainty. And a really key one for this study was that it wasn't able to establish causality. So since this was done on humans and it's just not ethical to manipulate the neurochemistry of patients, researchers were not able to manipulate an independent variable and then investigate its effects on a dependent variable. And so researchers were only able to establish correlations, they were able to establish associations, and this means that we don't really know. This could have been a bidirectional relationship. There could have been a third variable that was perhaps, leading to this increase in serotonin levels. Perhaps it wasn't ketamine. Perhaps it was patient's mood or expecting something, expecting positive results from the treatment. Again, there could be so many factors that could be responsible for increasing the serotonin levels. And again, kind of related to an inability to establish causality is we don't know how much of the improvement in symptoms is due to ketamine's effect on serotonin levels. Like, for instance, perhaps ketamine is influencing serotonin levels a moderate amount, but perhaps it's really influencing glutamate levels or really influencing AMPA levels. And that change is driving an alleviation of MDD symptoms. But again, because these are all associations, these are really just predictions that researchers are having to make. And they're not really able to establish any causal relationships. It's really just looking at potential correlations and associations. And so another unanswered question is, what is it specifically about ketamine as opposed to, for instance, traditional SSRIs that are able to alleviate these symptoms? What is ketamine doing that is bypassing the neural mechanisms in these SSRI-resistant patients that is being able to alleviate their symptoms of MDD? And so we have all these unanswered questions that really can inspire a lot of future studies and research. And one area that we can go in is applying this study's findings, or where it left off, to an animal study, and specifically focusing on rodents and using an invasive and experimental method. And so this would be a novel study, and our research question would be, how much of ketamine's effect on MDD symptoms in SSRI-resistant mice is attributable to its effect in balancing serotonin levels? And so I hypothesize that ketamine's effect on increasing serotonin levels plays a relatively small but significant role in treating SSRI-resistant mice, considering, again, the hypothesized importance of glutamate and AMPA receptors. And so here, my independent variable would be the imbalance of serotonin levels in SSRI-resistant mice, and my dependent variable would be major depressive disorder symptoms. And luckily, there have been some rodent studies that have found that MDD seemingly can exist in mice, and some indicators of it are having a decreased preference for sucrose, and this is related to anhedonia, which is the inability to enjoy things and have pleasure and all that. And so when mice are considered to kind of have a similar circumstance to MDD, they don't really show a preference for sucrose anymore, and that's one indicator of anhedonia. And then also another indicator of MDD in mice is a lack of social interaction. So I'm going to be measuring these as my dependent variables. And it's also important to note that although, again, we're taking like a huge step between humans and mice, there is some research to suggest that serotonin can play a similar role in mice's brains that it could be playing in humans' brains in terms of it being associated with major depressive disorder. So hopefully we're not making too big of a generalization, considering that there is some limited studies that are indicating that there may be some points of similarity. And so the methods for this study would be gathering SSRI-resistant mice and randomly assigning them to one of two conditions. In one condition, we would be increasing mice's serotonin to balance levels using a tryptophan IV. And tryptophan is an amino acid that synthesizes serotonin. And in the control condition, we would be using a placebo IV. And then in both conditions, we would give the mice ketamine infusions. And before and after, at all stages of the experiment, before they are either randomly assigned, then before they receive ketamine infusion, and then after all these stages, we would collect behavioral data in terms of looking at their sucrose preference and then also looking at their social interaction. And researchers would then analyze this data and see if the data supports the hypothesis that that ketamine, one, is potentially alleviating MDD symptoms, and two, serotonin plays a key role. And so if the data were to confirm that, then researchers would see in their results that after bringing serotonin levels into balance, that ketamine was not producing that significant of an improvement in symptoms for mice in the experimental condition. And compared to how much there's an improvement in symptoms for mice in the control condition. But if the data did not support my hypothesis, then we would see that potentially ketamine is still improving. It's still improving symptoms in these mice even after their serotonin levels are balanced. So ketamine is perhaps improving MDD symptoms through other neurotransmitters, and serotonin doesn't play that significant of a role. And so depending on whichever way that the data kind of lies, we have a lot of, we can find a lot of significance from the study, because manipulating serotonin levels and then measuring the effect of ketamine on MDD symptoms in mice can allow us to establish causal relationships, which is really valuable. It's something we weren't able to see in Tiger and All, but again, because this is an animal study and we're able to manipulate the IV and control for all these confounding variables, that allows us to establish causal relationships. And so it also, prompts the question of, okay, perhaps we're able to establish causal relationships, but then how much can we generalize results to human MDD treatment? And so, again, there are so many differences that it's really hard to generalize any kind of results we would get from this study to how we treat humans with MDD. But for instance, if we see that perhaps serotonin, seems to play a key role in the effect that ketamine is able to have on treating MDD in SSRI-resistant mice, then it might be pushing more research to look at perhaps, investigating if this is true in humans. Does serotonin play a really key role in ketamine improving MDD symptoms in SSRI-resistant humans? So that could really be a point of inspiring future research to, again, look at this and how it can apply for humans. And hopefully our data could also just elucidate some new information on the neural networks of ketamine, because we are able to bring serotonin levels into balance and then inject ketamine or infuse ketamine into these mice, and then we can kind of see, okay, is ketamine still having an effect on MDD symptoms? And that can really help us take a deeper look into the neural mechanisms of ketamine as an antidepressant in mice, which can potentially lead us to have more insight into how it's working in humans. And so that is the end of my section, and I'll pass it off to the next person.
Thank you, Tima, for that wonderful overview of a conceptual replication. I am now going to talk about the ethical considerations of using ketamine as a treatment for depression. The benefits of using ketamine for depression treatment is clear. For years, studies have shown that ketamine, being given intravenously, meaning through IV, or intranasally through the nose, have led to an improvement in depression symptoms. A study by Brown in 2000 was the first placebo-controlled, double-blind trial to assess the treatment effects of a single dose of NMDA receptor antagonist in patients with depression. The NMDA receptor antagonist in this case was ketamine. The subjects with depression evidenced significant improvement in depressive symptoms within 72 hours after ketamine, but not with a placebo infusion. This was studied using the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale scores, which have been used in many studies following this one. Another study that I want to look at studied the effects of ketamine over a longer period of time rather than just the few hours after the infusion. 6 years later, this study gave subjects an intravenous infusion of ketamine of the same dosage as the initial study, which was 0.5 milligrams per kilogram, and tested depression levels at multiple times in the week following the infusion. They found that subjects receiving ketamine showed significant improvement in depression compared to the subjects receiving placebo within 110 minutes after injection. This result remained significant throughout the following week. We can see this also in the diagram I've introduced on this slide, where we can see how ketamine treatment influenced the mean HDRS, which is the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale score, influenced the decrease of this mean HDRS compared to the placebo treatment, where HDRS was not significantly altered. Ketamine has been shown to be effective as a treatment for depression in countless studies, as those that I mentioned in the previous slide, but it's important to consider the long-term safety of ketamine use and research. Research has shown that repeated ketamine exposure is currently necessary for maintaining the antidepressant effects of ketamine. This was seen in the latter study that I reviewed in my last slide, where the effects of ketamine injection remained significant through the following week after injection, but following this week did not have meaningful results. This fact helps us consider the idea that people who are using ketamine as a depression treatment would have to continue using it potentially every week or even every month. This means that individuals undergoing treatment would be regularly exposed to ketamine, and therefore the effects of ketamine should be considered in how we view it. Due to ketamine's role in depression treatment still being formed, there's minimal research that studies what effects are associated with repeated ketamine use in treatment. Yet, we can look at useful evidence about the long-term effects of ketamine usage in ketamine abusers to be able to look at how depression is affected by ketamine over time and how the brain structure and cognitive functioning is influenced by repeated ketamine usage. Looking at how repeated ketamine use and potentially abuse affect the brain and its structure and functioning is important in how we view ketamine going forward as a depression treatment. A review paper by Strauss looked at many studies on the impact of ketamine abuse on brain structure and function. The review found that long-term recreational ketamine use was associated with lower gray matter volume and less white matter integrity in the frontal cortex, as well as cortical atrophy in different parts of the brain. The image I included on this slide demonstrates the effects of ketamine usage on gray matter volume. As you can see, there's different brain scans and of ketamine dependent individuals. That means either that they're repeatedly using it or potentially abusing it. And one can see that there's regions of smaller gray matter volume in these brains, which is a significant result in how we look at ketamine's effects on the structure of the brain. Moving on to the cognitive functioning, this review paper also found lower activity of brain regions for spatial memory and motor execution. This is also in alignment with the cognitive impairments observed in chronic ketamine users. Chronic ketamine users experienced memory impairment and executive functioning, as was found in many different studies that I looked at. And this lines up with the fact that there's lower activity in these brain regions. And these results are all very telling as to what repeated ketamine usage, such as through treatment where someone would potentially have to be exposed to ketamine on a repeated basis, such as every week, what effects this may have on brain structure. And this is really important to keep in mind as we think about how ketamine can be used as a depression treatment. Expanding my discussion of the effects of ketamine on cognitive functioning and brain structure, I also want to look at the direct cognitive effects of ketamine. And by direct, I mean the effects that are present when one is receiving the ketamine exposure or soon after, rather than years later as one has become addicted, as in the studies that I have found in the previous slides that look at ketamine abuse. To look at how ketamine has direct effects on cognitive functioning, I want to introduce an experiment that was done with healthy subjects where the subject was exposed to ketamine through IV and their cognitive functioning and symptoms were assessed. The results of the experiment revealed that subjects experienced reduced cognitive functioning and symptoms similar to the positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. The reduced cognitive functioning, one of the examples of this is that they had delayed word recall and other such cognitive impairments. These are really meaningful results in how ketamine influences our cognitive functioning, even within the exposure time. These findings indicate that the negative cognitive impacts of exposure to ketamine, even with healthy individuals that were only exposed 3 times. This raises concerns about the possible impacts of repeated ketamine usage, given that individuals who had not previously been addicted to ketamine or used ketamine were experiencing cognitive impairments just from three exposures through IV. As I spoke about in the beginning part of my discussion of the ethics of using ketamine as a depression treatment, ketamine holds much hope as a more accessible and effective treatment for depression. This was seen in studies that clearly showed that depression scale scores decreased with the exposure to ketamine. Yet, the use of ketamine also has reinforcing and toxic effects that pose it as an addictive substance, as it is, in fact, a drug that has been used and has been a major issue in the United States and in other countries as an abuse substance. Ketamine addiction and abuse causes significant harm to the individual and to society, and this is really important to keep in mind as we traverse the use of such an addictive drug as a potential treatment. We must consider the ethical implications of using ketamine as a treatment and research, and take measures to avoid ketamine addiction. Something that's especially interesting is exposing individuals to ketamine through research, where they, of course, consent to the study, but may not understand the cognitive effects and potential brain structure impacts that result from ketamine usage. As ketamine as a depression treatment is expanded, assessing the cognitive risks associated with ketamine usage is necessary. As ketamine grows to become a more widely used treatment for depression, it's important to think of measures that we can take to avoid the addiction and potential abuse of ketamine in this case. It's also incredibly important to make sure that participants in research studies, as well as people who are undergoing ketamine treatment for depression, are fully aware of its effects and the potential for addiction that come with ketamine, including all the different risks that it poses, so that they can make their own decisions based on this, as well as potentially including regulations to ketamine usage in the medical context. Our presentation covered the expanded review, historical basis, conceptual replication, and ethical considerations of ketamine being used as an antidepressant. We hope that you have gained a greater understanding of ketamine as a potential treatment for depression and the ethical considerations of its usage. We appreciate your time.